Good evening. Welcome to People's University, week 2 of the struggle for women's rights. And tonight we're going to step back in time. Last week we talked about the 19th Amendment because of the centennial. And next week we are going to talk about founding mothers. And our professor will be Jared Jenrette from Edinburgh University in Pennsylvania. So that's next week at 6:30, same place. And on this Tuesday, we will have it's September 1st at noon, our Lunch with Books program, a program on Walter Reuther, who was born here in Wheeling on September 1st, 1907. So we'll be talking to Nelson Lichtenstein, who wrote the definitive biography of Reuther. And we will show a video that we created paying tribute to Walter Reuther for his birthday. This evening, we have Joyce Salisbury. She is Professor Emerita of History from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. She is the author of many books and most recently has written and recorded courses for Great Courses and Audible, including Warriors, Queens, and Intellectuals, 36 Great Women Before 1400, and 10 Women Who Ruled the Renaissance. So obviously, she's perfect for this class this evening on the powerful women of history. I give you Joyce Salisbury.
Thanks, John, and thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to join this wonderful group you got here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a PowerPoint talking about these women and leave plenty of time at the end for questions. And I look forward to them. So without further ado, Sean, let's let her rip. Share screen and see what happens. All right, are we working? Here we go. Now, I'm going to talk about powerful women in history. And these are a long time ago. Medieval history is what I'm talking about. And I've organized these. What I've done is I've selected 8 women, and I'm doing 2 in each of these categories, 4 different ways women exerted power. First, I'm going to talk about 2 women who got power and used it remarkably effectively. Then I'm going to talk about 2 women who got mad and got revenge. Then I'm going to talk about 2 women who gained authority in a religious life. And finally, I got to say my favorite, women who achieved intellectual accomplishments. So here we go. First, the women who achieved power and exerted it mightily. And I'm going to start with, I wrote down Emperor Wu Zetian in China. It's a woman, but she wanted to be called emperor because she indeed was the only woman to rule as emperor and created her own dynasty, the Zhao dynasty. She ruled from 683 to 699 on her own, but she ruled much longer than that as a regent and as regent for her sons and presided over her husband, actually. Now, you have to understand, China at that time was Confucian. It's a man's world. A woman was supposed to be subordinate to her father, then her husband, then her son, and everybody was supposed to be subordinate to the emperor, and it would have been a wonderful, calm, orderly world. So that was the world she was born into. And when she was 13, she was summoned to court to be a concubine. Now, I should mention, we're going to see several women today who were 13 years old, and those of us who raised strong-willed 13-year-old daughters will understand that sometimes you just have to get out of their way, and we'll see that as we go along. But Empress Wu, she became a concubine, and of course, the job description of a concubine is to sleep your way to the top, but she made it work for her in remarkable and astonishing ways. And she ended up marrying the son of the emperor to whom she was a concubine, which was totally unheard of. And he was a weak emperor. He kind of sickly, and it left her a vacuum. and she began to exert power tremendously. Well, what she did, my slide image on the right side, you could see some torturing going on here. She invented a secret service. She invented new ways to torture her enemies. She sent her spies all over the country. Anytime someone opposed her, she was there and her representatives were there. She was ruthless, she took power, and most importantly, probably, she set up an apparatus that helped her descendants follow through equally strongly. What about support for women? Well, we like to think that women in power will sometimes step up and help other women out. She killed off her daughter-in-law, she tortured some other women, but she believed in supporting sort of the idea of women in charge. She wrote biographies of famous women to justify her own position. She enhanced the view of goddesses to enhance her own position. And she did say that women should be mourned as long as men. But I'm thinking that didn't help much for the women she tortured and exploited. She changed religion for a very good reason. I told you Confucianism is a man's world. She sponsored bringing Buddhism into China with a lot of money, and she built this giant Buddha in the Longmen caves outside of Luoyang in China. And this large female Buddha supposedly is an image of her. She had herself declared the incarnation of the compassionate Buddha. She was a living God. She was emperor and a god. Not bad. But like all of us, she began to grow old, and she searched for a way to stay young. She established what's called the Office of the Crane. The crane is supposed to be known for longevity. I have crane pictures hanging around my house in hopes that I too can get a little crane magic going on. But what she also did was what emperors always did before. Emperors took young lovers to try to use sexuality as a way of staying young. And she did the same thing. She got young men to be her lovers. Well, that was a little too much for her supporters and for the court. They executed the young men, and she retired to a convent to spend the rest of her days. But there weren't that many of them. She was 79 years old. She died in the year 705. And at the last moment, I think she was hedging her bets. She turned back to Confucianism and was buried with her husband, Gaozong, near Xi'an. And some writers say she turned back to Confucianism because she didn't want the reincarnation karma that came with all her secret police, all her executions. But not a bad job for a woman to move from concubine to empress. She took power and exerted it mightily. Here's another woman. And as you see, I'm giving you 8. I'm going through them pretty quickly. I hope they whet your appetite to find out more about each one. This is Khatun of the Mongols, Sorghaghtani. She ruled in the 13th century. And you can see this map down here at the bottom. The red is Kublai Khan, the purple is the Ilkhanate of Persia, the center part is Chagatais Khanate. Her sons ruled all of those, and they only did so because she was an effective ruler in her own right. This is the, so to show you, this is the genealogy of Genghis Khan. And over there you can see Tolui. That's Sorghaghtani's husband. And her 4 sons, Mongke, Kublai, Ugalai, and Arik, they were the ones that she groomed to rule and ruled, made sure they did. Now, Mongols, remarkably, the Mongol women were astonishingly important. Genghis Khan believed the men should go off and be fighting, and while the women handle all the administrative work and govern the land. Worked out for Genghis Khan's daughter-in-laws and daughters. And this is a book, The Secret History of the Mongol Queens, which really tells their story in a most effective way. So she prepared her sons to rule. And the first thing, to show you how wise she was, She knew that the wave of the future was literacy. Mongols had an oral tradition. They didn't read and write, but her sons did. She taught them to write Mongolian, and she made each of them learn a different language: Chinese, Persian, Arabic. They were prepared to rule the whole Eurasian continent. She also knew that fighting about religion is stupid. Well, we know that. She was a Christian herself, but her son Hulagu was Muslim. Kublai Khan, who you see here, was Buddhist. His wife, who you also see here, was Chabi. She was a Christian. And they believed that tolerating all religions would make things very effective. She prepared them to rule, but of course, if you can imagine, with all the power that's available, power struggles came about. She took care of it quickly. She ruthlessly killed all her opposition, men and women alike, confiscated their territory, and when she died in 62, at the age of 62, her sons were unopposed. Supposedly, she felt a little bad about all the ruthlessness that she had to exert to make sure her sons stayed in power, but I guess she didn't feel that bad. I think one of the biggest tributes to her I found on YouTube, if she's indicated the most powerful woman ever, you can't beat that as a way to be remembered. So these are two women who came to power and made it work very well. Now I've got two women who were motivated by rage, anger. And one, Boudicca of Britain, was born around AD 30. And she was born over here in the corner. My cursor doesn't work on this, but you can see the Iceni. Britain was a whole bunch of tribes, and she was their wife to the king, Prasutagus. He was a client king of Rome, independent, but paid some tribute. Boudicca was his wife, and they had two daughters, and they lived in these nice round huts, which is, by the way, indicative of an independent tribal society. When you have square houses, you know someone's paying taxes to someone, but round is independence. In AD 60, the king died. He left in his will half of his fortune to the Roman emperor, hoping that that would secure a peaceful transition, allowing Boudicca and the daughters to inherit the rest. But the Romans didn't play that way. As soon as he died, the Roman legions came in, the soldiers came in, raided the palace, beat Boudicca, and raped her two daughters. And that's the moment she argued for revenge. She went and spoke to all the people saying, "Prefer freedom to slavery. Avenge my daughter's rape." She got 120,000 followers. And in the artwork you see of her, she's always portrayed with the two young daughters whom she protected so effectively. Well, she took revenge anyway. And she went off to war. She rode in their wicker chariot and led her troops in battle. You could see she started in Norwich and then raided Colchester, burnt down London, and in the wonderful museum of the city of London, you can see they show the burn marks where she burnt it down, and up to St. Albans. She didn't. Usually in warfare during that time, you'd take hostages, you'd ransom them, steal a few things, and move on. She didn't. She was ruthless. As the Roman historian Tacitus said, "Never before or since has Britain ever been in a more disturbed state. She was only interested in slaughter and fire." As you can imagine, Rome wasn't going to let that happen. And you can see here on the purple lines, the movements of the Roman army coming down from the Irish Sea to meet her forces as they drove north from London, burning and pillaging all the way. Finally, the Roman army met her army. The Romans were way outnumbered. You can see here in the center, Boudicca with her British warriors, about 70,000 of them. Some argue even more. Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman legions, had only 10,000, perhaps a bit more. But what he had was the knowledge of the land and the knowledge of how to set up a battle site. He chose a spot with a dense forest all around, so her increased numbers couldn't make a bit of difference. And here's another thing that the Britons did way wrong. You see the semicircle with the carts and the non-combatants. They brought their family and their children in carts right behind to watch and cheer as the warriors fought. But that meant that the warriors couldn't retreat because the carts blocked the way. Well, you know where this is happening. If you saw the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe, you know how effective shows how the Roman legions defeated these reckless but brave tribal warriors. And the Roman conquest of Britain was complete. You can see the people in the round huts, the white cliffs of Dover, and Rome became ruler. And Boudicca, supposedly there were two ways that said she died. First was that she was killed in battle, but most of the legends say she survived and committed suicide by poison and poisoning her daughters as well. I think people didn't really like to think of her losing in the battle, but she did lose. But you know what? She was remembered. First, historians didn't write about her at all, but Queen Victoria, she resurrected the idea of Boudicca, and her husband built this great statue of Boudicca to remember this queen who defended the island of Britain, and just as Victoria was purportedly defending the island of Britain. And you can see the two daughters on the back of the chariot peeking out. Of course, it's a nice memorial, but I really hate today it's covered with souvenirs and tickets. You can't even tell who it is on that statue. You can't even read the plaque. I think they should move the t-shirts over to, I don't know, the Duke of Wellington or someone, and let Boudicca stand proudly there. But she is remembered for her revenge on the Romans. Now, there's another way to have revenge, best served cold. And this one, the Empress Pulcheria of Byzantium, Constantinople, there on the edge of the Black Sea. And this is an empress who lived in the 4th century. And what you're going to see, she gets revenge not by battle, but by changing the whole way that the Catholic Church looks at women and at the Virgin Mary. That was a serious served cold kind of revenge. Here's what happened. First, another 13-year-old, she took power, this Pulcheria. Her brother, Theodosius, was younger than she, and there were plenty of people at court who thought they would be regent, and she said no. She ruthlessly said, I'm in charge. Her brother agreed. She took the title of empress, and she even struck beautiful gold coins like this one that claimed, and that shows her dressed in military garb reserved for emperors, and she's got the hand of God blessing her at the top. So she's an empress, this 13-year-old, and she took control and loved it. She lived in this beautiful, look at this palace here of Constantinople. They have the hippodrome up at the top. Hagia Sophia, which is on the far right, which is in the news lately, wasn't built yet, but the whole palace complex, people bowed down and kissed the floor when she came. She sat in her throne room receiving people from all over the world who brought gifts and respect. She went to church here at this Hagia Arena. And one day she went in and she was insulted in her own royal church. Insulted by a new misogynist priest named Nestorius. As she walked in, as she was accustomed to do, and everyone bowed to her as they were accustomed to do, he said, only male priests may walk here. You can't come into the sanctuary. And she said, what? Why? Have I not given birth to God? He said, you have given birth to Satan. So the battle lines are drawn here. The question was, are women's bodies holy or contaminated? Was Mary's body holy or contaminated? Did Pulcheria's body preclude her coming into church? This was the battle line. And Nestorius, the priest, he said, I don't think it was God who was 2 or 3 months old. And he went on and he said, with diapers. No, God came in later. Mary gave birth to a human who then took on the mantle of God. And Pulcheria said, no, Mary is the mother of God. So here you see the battle lines. After much argument and quarreling, the third ecumenical council was called in 431 at Ephesus. And I'm sure there are some of you out there who've traveled to Ephesus and will recognize this beautiful marble roadway. It's a wonderful city to visit once this COVID is over. And women, now this was a tricky bit. Pulcheria was smart to choose Ephesus because there was only one church in the whole Christian world that was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It was in Ephesus, the heartland of Artemis. So Pulcheria got this big meeting held in the Virgin Mary's church. And the women of Ephesus marched in the street, committing violence. Nestorius said, fine, let Mary be the mother of God, but let's all stop fighting. She wasn't ready. Pulcheria didn't let it go. The people finally cheered, Mary the Virgin has deposed Nestorius, she who had strengthened the faith. Nestorius was exiled. He took his followers, and in fact, there were Nestorian Christians in China when Marco Polo visited, and they were still worshiping Jesus, the human baby in the manger, who later took on the mantle of God. Pulcheria established churches to Mary, and she brought this icon, which is the most famous one in Byzantium. It's purportedly painted by Luke, who wrote the gospel, and it's supposed to be an image of the Virgin Mary. It's too late for that, but nevertheless. And Pulcheria's aunt, Galla Placidia, builds the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. Mary, from an obedient Jewish girl, becomes Queen of Heaven, sitting side by side with Jesus. And you know what? In the 5th century, there was only one church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. That was in Ephesus. By the 12th century, almost all the Gothic cathedrals were dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Pulcheria won that dispute in spades. So while we're talking about religion, here we'll move on to my next category, women who took authority in a religious life. Now, when in the Middle Ages, if the politics and the mainstream outlets for women's authority were blocked, there was a parallel one that they began to take hold of. Now, you might be surprised thinking, well, wait, women can't be priests. There's a certain amount of exclusion, but they did find some outlet in a religious experience. And here are a couple of them. Early in the Middle Ages, in the 6th century, one of the most influential women who started women on a path of a religious outlet was Queen Radegund of France. And she lived in the 6th century. She's from the kingdom of the Thuringians. You can see there on the edge of the conquests of Clovis. Now the 12-year-old, here we have another child, she was captured when the king of the Franks, Clothar, invaded Thuringia, and she was captured in the midst of brutality. The description, the bed of the stream was filled with corpses, and the Franks rowed across the dead as if they were a bridge. She was captured at 12, but she got a temporary respite. The bishops persuaded the king to let her live in a kind of a villa up in the north of France, where she learned to read, and she began to read books that offered models of women's lives. She loved the stories of women's martyrdom and how they got their own destiny through a religious experience. She read church fathers, she read all of that. But when she was 18, the king said, okay, I'm going to marry her. He was in his 40s. He had 4 wives already, but he felt marrying this princess of Thuringia would consolidate his rule over her lands. Well, he got more than he bargained for. As the writer said, people said that the king had yoked himself to a nun rather than to a queen. She refused to eat with him. These little manuscript shows her life. She refused to eat with him. She wore a hair shirt under her clothing and prayed all the time. And even at night, she slept on the stone floor instead of in bed with him. He grew angry. He beat her. She didn't care. Finally, when he killed her brother, she escaped. And she went to Noyon and asked the bishop to give her a veil as a nun and allow her to take the vows. Well, the bishop said, oh, not me. The king will kill me if I do that. And she said, I don't care. And she gave herself the veil herself and took the vows herself. Of course, that didn't end the story. The king chased her. She fled. Finally, after many arguments, he negotiated a peace with her and said, fine, I'll let you live as a nun. And only when he died did she finally feel safe. But she founded a convent, a refuge for women, and 200 women left their husbands or left their fathers and came to live that life with her, with Saint Radegund, in her convent. And they were able to read and study and have companionship there. And she lived 26 more years engaging in correspondence with all the great people in the lands and traveled, and she had a great life, according to her biographer. And she's her burial space here. Her influence was profound. She wrote a rule for nuns. Her biographies were much read, and women throughout the Middle Ages sometimes were forced into convents, but more often some selected that life as opposed to living in the world. Now, another religious figure, finally one you've heard of, I hear a great sigh of relief, right? Here we have Joan of Arc in France, and she lived 1412 to 1431. And honestly, her story is so extraordinary. If it weren't so well documented, we would all believe it's totally fake. But here was the situation. You can see on the map. This was during the 100 Years' War between England and France. And this was in the last stage of the 100 Years' War. And as you see, the red part is England and the blue part is France. So France was losing. You can see the English even had Paris. The king was a captive in his own palace. And he had even been forced to sign a treaty that said his heir would not inherit the throne of France. The throne of France would go to England. Now, Joan becomes a warrior. The French lose the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, famous battle. The glory of the French chivalry, the knights in shining armor, lose to the English longbowmen, who then bring them down. The English then raid the countryside, raping and pillaging. And this happens when Joan was only 3 years old, so she heard about it and saw the raiding and the pillaging. And here we have a 13-year-old girl again. She has visions. She hears the voices of the Archangel Michael and the saints Catherine and Margaret. And they say, liberate France from the English and crown the Dauphin Charles as king. Well, if it were me, I would say, I think you got the wrong number. But the extraordinary thing was, she went to the king and said, I'm going to liberate France. Just give me some army and, some soldiers. And sadly, that was the best offer he had. Her plan was first to lift the siege at Orleans. You can see it there on the edge of the company of the French territories. And she did. She led the armies. She was wounded, but they succeeded in lifting the siege. Now, okay, how'd she do it? There are several sort of ideas about it. Some practical folk suggest that she had a good eye for cannons, the new weapons, and was able to lay them out properly. But that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. What makes more sense was now the people were fighting for an idea of France, not just for a king. You know, they had kings called Charles the Simple. What was it to them whether one king or another king ruled? But with Joan, they were fighting for France. And I think that new spirit of nationalism was what transformed this war. She had the king crowned. You see her standing next to him. And this moment is reproduced in tons of paintings, crowned in 1429. Yeah, well, that's how the story should have ended, but it didn't. It goes worse from here. She was captured by the English allies, the Burgundians, who turned them over to the English. Well, and usually in the 100 Years' War, captives were simply ransomed back and could carry on from there. But in a singularly moment of ingratitude, the French king was unwilling to ransom her, and she was turned over to the English, and she was sent to the Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition was a court that was designed to find out what you believed. It wasn't that she did anything wrong, right? That's a regular court. The Inquisition is a court to find out your beliefs. And they went on trial from January till May in 1431. And here were the charges. First, heresy, believing that her voices came from the saints. The second was witchcraft. Well, who else? What else could you imagine that this young girl could win a battle? Third, and most interesting, dressing as a man. You know, she was violating these gender roles. She wouldn't take off her blue jeans, well, loosely translated. And finally, disobedience to the church. She was worn down while in jail. She was questioned. She questioned her own ideas. And so finally, in 1431, she was exhausted. She signed a document denying a belief in her voices and saying that she would obey from then on. And they put on a dress. But then, when they came to let her out of jail, she had dressed again as a man, and she had said, "I believe my voices come from God." She recanted her confession, and she was burnt at a stake in 1431. The results of this, well, you can see France won the 100 Years' War by 1453. You can see that the part that was green, that was England, is now all of France. France emerged much stronger, and they emerged with the idea of being French. And Joan, well, her parents appealed to the church and had her sentence, the Inquisition sentence, lifted. She was found innocent, and in 1920, she was made a saint and the patron saint of France after she appeared to give help to some of the soldiers in the trenches in World War I. I guess that's a happy ending for Joan. Now, my last category are two women who are known for their intellectual achievements. And the first, Hypatia of Alexandria. She lived right around the turn of the 5th century, 350 to 415. And here you could see her, Alexandria in Egypt. Now, Alexandria was the center of learning. The library there had been known, was the greatest. It had served to foster the greatest scientists, Euclid, Archimedes, Ptolemy. The mathematician Theon was Hypatia's father, and he taught her everything she knew, and it turned out everyone agreed she was a better mathematician than her father ever was. She wrote all kinds of things, tracts on conics and other kind of mathematical treatises. Copernicus was supposed to have used her writings when he developed his theories in the 17th century. She was also a practical sort. This little item on the left is a hydrometer she invented and built to way to measure the density of liquids against water. She also was reputed, she didn't invent the astrolabe, but she certainly improved it. So mathematics, science, she was brilliant. But her favorite thing was philosophy. In 400, she actually became the head of the School of Philosophy in Alexandria. The Christian bishop wrote, "She honorably presides over the mysteries of philosophy." And she was even paid by the state, which is virtually unheard of. Now, I need a minute to explain, to understand her influence, these two competing religious principles in the 4th century. One, of course, was Christianity. The other was Neoplatonism. Now, both of these claimed to bring the divine and the human closer together. Christianity did it in the person of the incarnate Jesus. The Neoplatonists had this little chart here I've got. The Neoplatonists said, well, really, God was the one, and he sends down emanations. And the first emanations then turn into the word. And it goes down, and these emanations then become a world soul and come down and join us. Well, you might notice that looks kind of like the Trinity, because what happened in the next, I'm going to say 40 years, by 410, Neoplatonism and Christianity have become merged. But Hypatia was teaching Neoplatonism while the bishop was seeing it as competition. Her influence on Christian understanding was huge. Christian bishops wrote, and you can see these ideas merging together. Didn't help her. In 415, as she was riding her chariot through the town, a Christian mob grabbed her off her chariot and murdered her by chopping her with either oyster shells or pottery shards. The sources are a little bit unclear. You see that guy on the left carrying a bunch of pottery shards. And here she was too influential and she was killed. But of course, her memory lived on dramatically. Here's a little asteroid that's named after her, the Hypatia asteroid. And a journal of feminist philosophy is named after Hypatia. And there's a crater on the moon named after Hypatia. I like that. Her feet on the ground and her name up there in the skies that she studied so effectively. There's a modern library at Alexandria now. They're rebuilding it, 2002. I like to think that somewhere there's some young woman who's as great a mathematician as Hypatia and will have an easier time of it. My last intellectual lady is Lady Murasaki of Japan. She lived from 978 to 1031. She was a daughter of a famous and powerful clan, Fujiwara clan. Her father was an administrator and a poet. And the thing was, in Japan in the 10th century, you had to write poetry to be skillful and good at anything. I mean, to be important, to be smart, to be beautiful. And he taught her poetry from the time she was very young, and she got very good at it. She made a good marriage, had a daughter, but her husband died. And in her grief, she began to write poetry to try to remember him. She went to court as a lady in waiting and read her poetry there. And while she was in court, oh, here, I forgot, I gave you a little, put in some of her poetry to give you an idea of the kind of poems she wrote. As the song of the crickets fades in the hedge, it's impossible to stop autumn's farewell. How sad they must be too. You notice this poetry grabs a moment of beauty, and that's one of the strengths and one of the perfection of her work. Chancing to meet again, did I truly see you? Or before I could tell, had you disappeared behind the clouds, base of the midnight moon? As life flows on, who will ever read it? This keepsake to her whose memory will never die. You see, everything's fleeting, but to capture that beautiful moment, that is the meaning of life for Lady Murasaki. Now, that would be enough, you would think, But she wrote The Tale of Genji, the first novel. It's a novel of seduction and beauty and feelings and poetry. It's longer than War and Peace. And I read it many, many years ago when I was young, and I couldn't believe how different it was, how people might fall in love with the handwriting, how the world was not my world. It was wonderful. And her hero is a whole different kind of hero. This hero, Genji, excels in dance and poetry and deep feelings that he expresses easily, and he expresses them as he seduces women. Love as a fleeting moment of beauty. And he doesn't exploit them. If they don't want to go to bed with him, he'll go off and mourn. But it shows a whole different world. And in the 12th century, it was illustrated. The illustration that we still have most of it now, it's 450 feet long with more than 100 paintings. Courtiers looked at it, and as someone read the story, they could see the illustrations. More illustrations done in the 17th century. This wonderful tale of Genji goes on, and its popularity was not an ephemeral moment. It was the first book to be printed using movable type in Japan, translated into many languages, of course, including English, where it captured my attention. And so not only is it influenced as a whole aesthetic, as a moment of love, as a moment of beauty, it influenced even the geishas in Kyoto, who for so many years later looked back to this tale of Genji as a way of capturing beauty and its ideal. Those are my 8 women from the medieval period, but let me assure you, they were not alone in their influence all over the world. When I published my Great Courses with 36 influential women, I got messages saying, but wait, you didn't include my favorite medieval or ancient woman. There's so many, and we need not think they were outside of the mainstream at all. Medieval women, ancient women, women before the modern age always influenced their society. The only reason we may not know it is because historians chose not to write about it. Women in the ancient world influence their society every day. And you know what? They do today as well. We shape the past and will shape the future. And you know what? That's a good thing. That's the end of my story for the day. I'm going to stop sharing and hope to take your questions about any of these ancient women, any of the women of the future, meaning of life, you know. I think I'm going to stop sharing, yeah. Maybe. Here I go. There we go. Oh, here I have my first question. How did Sorghaghtani become Christian? She was born that way. She came from a tribe up in the northern part who had been Christian forever. Do you remember I told you the Nestorians, when they left from Pulcheria, moved east, there were always Christians up there, and this was a Christian tribe up there in the north. So when Genghis Khan was looking for a bride for his son, chose her, and it was just by chance that she was Christian, and she remained Christian her whole life. It was so different when the missionaries first went there. They were sort of appalled because they didn't have wine, so instead of wine, they drank fermented mare's milk, and instead of bread for the host, they ate something else. And the missionaries from the West weren't sure they were like really Christians, but she was indeed. So that's how she got to be Christian. Good question, thanks. Did Roman senators or emperors have advice from wives or other women? Oh, absolutely. There are some women who are so influential. Plotina taught Emperor Trajan, who was considered one of the good emperors. We have all the records of her talking about don't tax people inappropriately, here's some how to act in a moral way. Oh yes, these Roman women were very, very influential. And in fact, one of the, there's so many good stories, but I'll have to tell you this as one of the women who became very influential. She insisted that her grandson, who she made him emperor, establish a Senate of women so that the women could be senators and have their own meetings as well. Women were always influential. Radegund, was she a known healer? Oh yes. Oh yes. All these nuns. I mean, if you wanted to go to a doctor, you better go to the local convent. They were much more influential in knowledge in herbs and all other kind of aspects of life. Yes, she was a healer as well. Isn't that funny? Curious about the number of women age 13. Adolescence is developmentally a time of religious awakening, relationship between religion and self-awareness or confidence of these women. Do you know, it's so hard that's a great question. And there's so many ways to go down to answer. So first, let's look at how spiritual awakening or religious awakening wasn't so separate from other aspects of life. So of course, when you get Joan of Arc and she hears these spiritual awakening, it's at 13, I think, when, or thereabouts, it's early adolescence, girls want to find something larger than themselves. And you know, and sometimes that turns to religion, and sometimes that turns to getting away from your mother and finding your own path. I mean, it really is an age of independence and spiritual awakening and spiritual in the sense of something bigger than you. And those are great when the young adolescents can find that. Why do I think Joan of Arc was confessed? She didn't know she would recant immediately. She didn't know that. She confessed, and we have the trial transcripts, so you can really see her state of mind. She confessed because she was exhausted. If you wear someone down, let's talk about 4 months. She's imprisoned and questioned by authority figures and browbeat and beaten down for months. I think she questioned herself as well. And she said, fine, you're right, I give up. You know, haven't we seen so many people who one hears about people accused of crimes who confess with much less time. But then, once she had done so, you can read what she writes. When they came to her, she had put on her men's clothing again, and she said, you know, my voices spoke to me now. They told me I was doing the right thing. I can't go against my voices. I don't know, it's sad on so many fronts, it's hard to get my head around. The Inquisition that judged Joan of Arc was almost 50 years before the Spanish Inquisition. Was this the model for the Spanish Inquisition? Okay, more good questions. All right, the Spanish Inquisition was 50 years later. It was reinstituted for a very specific reason, to find the secret Jews and secret Muslims in Spain. It was kind of part of the Renaissance fear of Islam. The earlier Inquisition that got Joan was the Papal Inquisition, and the answer is yes, it was the model for the Spanish Inquisition, but its remit wasn't directly for Jews. Its job was to weed out bad ideas. You know, the Inquisition is such a horrible idea on the face of it. Can you imagine, you know, finding out what you're thinking? If you're thinking wrong, you know, then no idea is safe. But to try to understand their mindset, they believed that if one idea could contaminate everyone else, that everyone else's soul was in danger. I mean, it's still a crazy idea, but so to answer your question more succinctly, the Papal Inquisition that got Joan was set up by the papacy to find heretics. after it subsided a little bit, when the Spanish were looking for a way to make sure that Jews who converted, stayed converted, weren't being secretly practicing, they instituted the Spanish Inquisition. And then the Portuguese introduced the Portuguese Inquisition as well. Good question. 2 or 3 contemporary women would you say were the most influential today? It's so hard. I was on a program recently and they asked me the same question, and you know, okay, I'm going to come up with a few influential. There are just so many, you know. Eleanor Roosevelt. How can you go wrong with Eleanor Roosevelt, you know? But I like to think that the ones that are most influential for all of us are people like my 3rd grade teacher, you know, my banker, the newscasters who show us on TV every evening that women can show the news and express themselves, the female judges, the lawyers, those of us who worked our way up to get into positions of visibility is what women need. I was the first woman in the history department forever ago when I started teaching, and now there are lots of them. I mean, I think the influential women today who have come to the top did so on the shoulders of all of our women who came before us. So I can't pick any now. We'll all have our favorites, won't we? Why did Joan of Arc change her mind? I know, and dress like a man and do all of those things. Because when she was alone there, after she confessed, I know, because I've read the transcripts, she thought that she would be comforted. She thought it would be over, that she would be released and that it'll be done. But what she discovered in the dark, in that dungeon, in a dress, she discovered that everything that made her, her voices, her identity, her spirituality, all that went away. And her voices said to her, no, put your jeans on and, you know, don't give up your conscience. So that's why she did. I mean, reading the transcript is such a poignant tale. What about these women who made it able for them to overcome gender discrimination to become, oh, what was it about them? Okay, it's a really good question because it comes to us today. What is it about women who can overcome so much to kind of rise to the top? And I don't know. I mean, in part, it's got to be something inside, you know. It's got to be that strength of will that says, you know what, enough. I'm not going to put up with this, you know. Like Pulcheria walking into the church. No, you're not going to kick me out. I mean, there's a strength of will that's part, but I also think part of it is the opportunity to have had some examples of women who've made it before us, even if it's like Pulcheria, women on a coin. If you can look at a coin that has a woman on it, you can say, oh, all right. That's why I think, by the way, we need women on our money. And so it's examples of women before us, and it's that deep internal, I don't know, fire or steel that says, you know, no. It's like Joan of Arc. You know, no, I'm not going to buckle. I don't know if that's the right answer, but it's an answer.
Okay, I'm going to jump in now because I don't think I made it clear that we are auctioning off tonight stemless wine glasses. And also, I want to thank the Heinz History Center because they donated a total of 12 passes, free passes to the Heinz Center. And we'll be auctioning off 2 tonight. So there are 3 chances to win. And if you ask a question quickly, you can get in the drawing. Last chance. But I want to thank Joyce for a very interesting program tonight. And I wanted to ask my own question, which was about Grace O'Malley. Grania, the great Irish.
Yes, the great Irish pirate. She's terrific.
Can you say a little bit about her, just a little bit?
Well, well, let's just start. She lived in Ireland during the early Renaissance, and she lived in a castle there by the shore where they had ships. Her father was had ships that went out, and they traded, and if sometimes they did a little raiding as well. Oh well, and she was one who actually took over his job, became a pirate, raided all over the place, was captured, confronted Queen Elizabeth. There's this great, you can read this transcript as well as the dialogue between the pirate Grace and Queen Elizabeth as they're sitting there talking to each other. And Grace says, well, I'm just a widow. I need to earn a living. How about this? I promise I'll only raid Spanish ships and I won't raid yours anymore. And so Queen Elizabeth said, fine, go off and go raid Spanish ships. And Grace O'Malley continued her long life raiding whatever ships she wanted. Great story.
Okay, thank you for.
Is she a personal favorite of yours, Sean?
Yeah, I'm sorry. The she king of the Irish, the she king of the Irish Sea.
Yeah.
Yeah, Grania. We named our cat after Grania. Boudicca would be the other favorite of mine. I like the Celts, I guess.
I guess.
Here we go. We're going to draw for the wine glasses. Well, there is one more question. Let me just put that up there since she asked.
Why were the women I spoke of respected by the men of their time and given a voice and power to influence? In part, you see, some of these women took power. They took it. I mean, Empress Wu, if you disagreed with her, you'll be tortured. They listened. And so sometimes the women were in a position of power and took it and insisted. But sometimes, like Hypatia, they recognized this one smart lady, she knows more math than I do. I'll listen. So it's like through these different ways, these 4 ways that people get attention, and lots of women were ignored, but lots of them were listened to.
Very good. Okay, here we go. I have all the people who ask questions right here in my hand. So I'm going to pull 3. The first one will be for the wine glasses. And the winner is, let's see, Bonnie Thurston.
Congratulations, Bonnie.
Okay, very good. The winner of one of the Heinz History pairs of free passes to the History Center is Carolyn Ziegler.
Congratulations.
Very happy to give one to Carolyn. And let's see, the other set of passes go to Sarah Clark. Even though she didn't ask a question, she made a lot of great comments, so I put her in the drawing. And she will have 2 free passes to the History Center. And as I said, thank you, Joyce. Very good. Excellent program. Next week, Jara Jenrette, Founding Mothers. Thank you to all who attended. And this was a really good program. I enjoyed it myself.
Thanks a lot for your hospitality, and thank all the listeners.
Yes.
See you next time.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. See you next week.